Hey, it's Amber from Biceps After Babies, and I'm going to teach you how to perform the squat. So the squat is one of the most fundamental movements that we do in lifting, and it's one that you're going to want to get really good at and include in your programming. So we're going to start with a bodyweight squat, and then we can take what we learned for the form for a bodyweight squat and apply it to when we are lifting a barbell. The biggest thing when you are squatting is as you are dropping down into the squat, I want you to think about your hips and your knees breaking at the same time, which means in order to do that, your knees must slide forward at the same time as your hips go back. So a lot of times people will cue one or the other. They'll think about, oh, I just need to push my hips back. And if you do that and don't slide your knees forward, you start to go over into a good morning position. And if you think about just sliding your knees forward without breaking at the hips, then you're putting a whole lot of stress forward on your knees. We don't want either of those extremes. We want somewhere in the middle where we are breaking at the hips, meaning that hip socket is closing, that knee angle is closing at the same time. So when I think of my squat, I think of starting with my chest up in nice alignment, and as I come down, pushing the knees forward and the hips sitting back simultaneously so that I'm going down into that squat and then coming straight up. A complaint I hear of a lot of people is in terms of getting to depth at their squat. In order to be considered at depth for your squat, your hip crease must drop below your kneecap. And so a lot of people get stuck trying to squat past here. They're like, I can't, how do I get lower than there? So a couple things that'll really help you in getting a full range squat, because we always want to make sure when we're squatting, we are doing a full range squat. One of the things that will help you is to turn your toes out slightly. You want about a 30-degree turn rotation outward. That's going to allow room in the pelvis as you drop down to be able to get down into that squat. It's really hard to squat to death with your toes pointed straight ahead. So turn those toes out about 30 degrees. The second cue I want you to remember is shove the knees out. A lot of times people think about pushing the knees forward, and as you drop down into the squat, I want you to think about pushing the knees out. So as I'm dropping down into the squat, I'm thinking knees out, knees out, knees out, knees out, knees out. And this allows me to get really deep into that squat, both with that turn out of the toe and with that knees out cue. Now, one thing that many people do when they're squatting is they drop the chest. So that looks like this. They keep the chest nice and high, and then as they try to get into depth, they start to drop the chest down to try and get down into the squat. I really want you to think about lifting that chest up nice and tall. So as you sit down into the squat, it can really help to put your hands out. It helps cue that chest up. We keep the chest up nice and tall, all the way down to the bottom of the squat and all the way back up. Notice my torso is literally dropping vertically. Vertically down, vertically up. I'm not going forward, I'm not going back. I'm staying right over the midfoot. Once you feel really comfortable with body squats, then we can go to the bar and start adding weight on the back. Now, once we get into a rack and we're loading a barbell onto our back, there are two basic ways that we can load that barbell onto our back. You'll hear what's called high bar squats versus a low bar squat. The difference is simply where you place the bar on your back. A high bar squat is going to be placed up on the traps, so it's a much higher position on the back, whereas a low bar squat is going to be placed on the rear delts. So on the back of the shoulder, on the meaty part of the back of the shoulder. Low bar squats, because they are further away from the midline of the person, they recruit more of the posterior chain. So low bar squats tend to be what our power lifters favor, because you're able to lift heavier weights, typically with a low bar squat, because you're able to recruit the posterior chain. Big muscle groups like the glutes, the hamstrings, these big, huge muscle groups, we're able to recruit more of them, which means typically you're able to push more weight. For a beginner, I really recommend just starting out with high bar squats. It's a much easier position to get into. It's just, you're just placing the bar and resting it on the traps of your back. So we're gonna get into a high bar squat position. When you come into the rack, you want to get under the bar, make sure your hips are all the way under the bar, and stand up, release the bar from the hooks, and then take 1 to 2 steps back into position. What you don't want to do is like take a bunch of steps and waste a lot of energy trying to get into position. It should look like this. Stand up, lock the knees out, take a step 1, 2, and then maybe like a third just to get situated into that squat position. From here, we're gonna do exactly what we did with our body weight squat. We are going to think about the knees tracking forward, breaking at the hips and the knees simultaneously, pushing all the way, getting our hips down into that squat position, and driving all the way back up through the heels, through the midfoot, to the top of the squat. Another rep, down and up. The whole time you want to be bracing that core. That's going to keep your torso nice and tight, be able to transfer that load through the squat. When we're done, we come hit the bar against the uprights and lower it down into the rack. And that's how you perform the squat.